Hello, this is Fergus Ryan. Welcome to my presentation on how I paint an egg tempera painting from start to finish. Up to the late 15th century, artists like Sandro Botticelli were painting in a medium of dry colour pigments mixed with egg yolk and water. By the mid-1400s, the new medium of oil paint was being introduced, and for a time artists used a mixture of egg yolk and oil known as tempera grassa. As oil became the standard medium, the techniques of egg tempera were gradually lost. But egg tempera was brought to prominence again in the 20th century by artists such as Howard Pyle and Andrew Wyeth, whose tempera Winter 1946 is shown here. Here I will take you through my own egg tempera painting process. We'll begin with making the special ground for the egg tempera painting, which is called true gesso. This is not the so-called acrylic gesso, which is unsuitable as the egg tempera does not form a strong bond with the acrylic and may simply peel off its slicker surface. Next, the panel will be prepared with sizing to seal it, and then coated with several layers of gesso, as we'll explain in a moment. Making the egg tempera paint itself is the easiest part and a pleasure in itself. And finally, I will take you step by step as I build up the complex egg tempera surface of one of my large paintings entitled Islanders. First then, making the gesso. In this session I will be preparing two large panels of about 2 feet by 4 feet each, or about 61 by 122 centimeters. The process begins with the binder that holds the gesso together, which is either gelatin, which is used in cooking, or more traditionally rabbit skin glue, as shown here. It comes in flakes that will be dissolved in water. I made 2 bowls of warm glue with the rabbit skin granules, one for sizing the panel and a larger bowl for making the white gesso. Bowl 1, shown here, is for the sizing. Into this bowl I poured 3 cups of water and slowly added 3 tablespoons of the glue flakes and stirred. The glue will not dissolve properly until the water is warmed. I placed the bowl on a saucepan with about 5 centimeters of water, or 2 inches, heated to a moderate temperature. I think I used a setting of about 4 or 5 on my electric hob here. A double boiler could be used too. The glue must not get too warm, and certainly not above 57 degrees Celsius or 135 degrees Fahrenheit, or it will change the structure of the material. I usually kept mine around 110 degrees Fahrenheit or 43 degrees Celsius. Next, the larger bowl, which will be used for making the gesso. Into this second bowl I poured 6 cups of water and slowly added 9 tablespoons of the rabbit skin glue. Experience tells me this should be adequate for the 2 large panels, which will be coated 8 times on the front and 3 or 4 perhaps on the back to prevent warping. The glue was dissolved on the saucepan in the same way as the first bowl, and when both were cooled I put them in the refrigerator overnight. In the morning the glue is firm and hard like a strong jelly. By breaking the surface in the thumb test, I can check the consistency. If the break sides are too glossy and smooth, then more water is needed. The sides of the break should have some obvious texture. The mixture is cool now and will liquefy again quite easily when it's heated. I'm using a cooking thermometer to keep an eye on the temperature, which once again I will allow to rise to about 110 degrees Fahrenheit or 43 degrees Celsius. Gesso is prepared with powdered chalk or gypsum. In fact, gesso is the Italian word for gypsum. There are various kinds: gypsum from Italy or chalk from France. The chalk is regarded by some as being a little bit better. This is a tub of whiting from Robertson's in London, but the powder is available from various suppliers: Corneliussen's, Sennelier, Rowney's and so on. So now I'm adding the gesso powder to the warm glue in the larger bowl. I've warmed the solidified glue mixture by placing the bowl on my saucepan containing water, and to the warm glue mixture I gradually added 9 cups of the white powder. In order to prevent dry lumps forming, it mustn't be added too quickly. The chalk powder has to be allowed to float through the sieve like snow falling on the warm glue, while stirring it all the time to cause it to dissolve. This is certainly easier at the beginning when it's still very light. You can also add some titanium white pigment if you wish to improve the whiteness of the surface further, but I usually don't find that necessary, and in this case I added only about a spoonful. Here's my temperature check thermometer. This one is marked in Fahrenheit, and I'm watching the temperature of the gesso all the time I'm adding the powder to it. So I'm once again keeping it below 135 degrees Fahrenheit or 57 Celsius. Now, to strain out any undissolved lumps that may form in the gesso mixture, I pour the whole mixture into a second bowl through a mesh sieve one more time, just to make sure it's as uniform and smooth as possible. So when the gesso is fully dissolved, the texture should be like light cream. It's probably best to allow this to settle for some time before using it. I actually started the application of the mixture to the panel the next day. The mixture will solidify again as it cools and can simply be reliquefied in maybe 10 minutes or so by placing it on the saucepan or double boiler. So now preparing the panel itself. I'm preparing 2 large MDF panels which are 9mm thick, as you can see here. If required, they can be cut up into smaller panels later for smaller paintings. First then, I size the MDF panels with the warm glue mixture in bowl 1, using here a 3.5-inch gessoing brush made by Liquitex, but any similar large soft brush should do. Both sides of the panel need to be sized for protection, as well as the edges. During this process, I support the panels on a number of mugs while I'm sizing and gessoing. I leave the 2 glue-sized panels overnight to dry naturally. The warm gesso mixture can now be applied to the MDF panel. You could also use untempered masonite, but that product is becoming somewhat more difficult to obtain. Or you can use wood, as they did in the Renaissance period, and poplar is a good choice for smaller paintings. To start, I covered the back with a couple of layers of the gesso, though further layers can be added later on. Painting the gesso like this on both sides ensures that the warping of the panel will be minimized. Though actually I've really had very little difficulty with that, because I place these panels into quite strong frames, and the frames are going to make sure any remaining slight warping will be eliminated. So then I'm going to apply up to 8 coats on the painting side, and here then are my 2 completed true gesso panels. They are a beautiful object to behold, I have to say, and the panels here have been sanded after being coated with an orbital sander, that is, one of those flat ones that oscillates or vibrates, not a rotating sander which will make gouges in the surface. Anyway, the result of the sanding is a beautifully silky smooth surface. It's like a sheet of white marble-like chalk. So now my panel is ready for the egg tempera painting to begin. Now for the fun part, which is making the paint medium itself and mixing the paint. So after cracking some free-range eggs, though any fresh eggs should do, I pour out the white carefully into a small bowl. It will be discarded as it's not part of the painting process, though it may appear in a meal in the kitchen soon, I expect. I roll the yolk sac carefully around on a square of kitchen tissue to remove all remaining white that's adhering to it, and then I roll it again on my hand. And now for the tricky part, which is picking up the yolk sac very carefully with a careful pinch between my thumb and forefinger and piercing it with a knife to allow the yellow yolk to fall into a small glass. This is much easier with fresh eggs, as later on the sac tends to weaken in older eggs. I'm using 2 eggs today for today's painting preparation. So to finish making the egg medium, I add distilled water. As a rough guide, it's 2 parts of egg yolk to 1 part of water, although experience will show you that different eggs have different consistencies. Here you may notice I've made a small mark on the glass just to help me estimate how much water I'm adding. It's not necessary to use distilled water, although it is purer, and here's a secret free tip: you can get distilled water for nothing from your dehumidifier if you have one. So just a final stirring of the egg and water to make the egg emulsion, and this is our paint medium, and we're ready now to add it to the pigment to make our paint. The colours used in egg tempera come in the form of powder, and together they've quite an exotic appearance on my palette. To make the paint, I take just a small amount with my palette knife of the pigment and place it on my glass palette. Here I'm using raw umber I picked up at Source in Roussillon in Provence in France. That is an amazing place from which a lot of our ochre colours come, and the ground itself is literally ochre of various colours. Next, a paste is made just by adding a few drops of water with an eyedropper and mixing it with a palette knife. This is called tempering. Finally, I add the egg medium, approximately the same value as the pile of tempered paint, and mix it all together with my palette knife. So it's really very simple and takes only a few seconds to mix the paint. Oh, one more thing. Just to keep the egg from developing any later mold, I add a few drops of white vinegar into my egg emulsion when I make it. So now it's ready for use, and we're ready to begin the painting. Here's a sort of family photo of my pigments waiting to show off their true colours, with my newly prepared true gesso panel on the easel eager to go. I've placed the beautiful jars of powdered pigment from all over the world around the edge of my large glass palette, which I've set on top of an old computer table here with casters. The palette is made of a thick piece of MDF board. I think it was about 2 centimeters or maybe 3/4 of an inch, and then there's a sheet of mid-grey paper, and on top of that finally a sheet of glass. And I edge the whole thing with wood raised slightly above the glass surface to keep everything from falling off. This palette is about 20 inches by 30 inches, and that's my new true gesso panel protruding in on the left. So now I'm ready and eager to start my new painting. These are the initial broad strokes to lay in the first layers. Egg tempera, unlike oil, dries almost immediately, and the later finishing textures will be painted with a tiny brush in luminous, transparent crosshatch strokes, finished with some opaque highlights. Egg tempera can be glazed. It can be scratched through, wiped, applied layer by layer with makeup sponges, but it must never be applied thickly or it will crack off and peel away disastrously. Here's an early stage detail on the right side of the panel. This is at the end of my first day of painting. The grass textures are being indicated in this early stage by patches of layered and crossed hatch touches of various colours, and here I used terre verte, cobalt blue, raw umber, yellow ochre, Naples yellow, which is a little opaque, and then a beautiful pinkish purple colour called cadmium red purple. The houses are indicated here with a black called mineral black, which I got in Roussillon, and those are my first touches, and of course titanium white, although I tend to keep the use of opaque titanium white for later on in the process. So you can see there's a long way to go till this is refined enough to look real, but hey, not bad for the end of day one. The process of painting the grass and vegetation is a series of layers of warm and cool, transparent and opaque dots, dashes, blotches, strokes, until I'm happy with how developed the texture is and how credible the illusion of reality. This is optical mixing, where a general impression of colour, overall colour, is produced by tiny touches of many individual colours. Egg tempera requires a patient, almost meditative approach, and really I don't think about how long this will take. I just do whatever is needed until I have a sense that it's done. The quality of watery light is important here for my purposes, as the loneliness of the scene is emphasized by this contre-jour viewpoint, that is, something painted against the light or backlit. This detail is about 1/3 of the width of the full painting and about half the height. Now moving left to the centre of the painting, I've very roughly indicated the forms of a central group of abandoned houses on the island, with the first loose indication of sea and distant headland in the background. As you can see, it's all fairly rough at this stage, and the final image will be a great deal more unified and detailed than it is here. Indicating the grasses is a very slow process of weaving the textures in crosshatched strokes until I feel that the surface is real and cohesive. It feels extraordinarily like I'm weaving the earth itself in my hands, a creative act out of the colours on my palette. This central detail, once again, shows about 1/3 of the width of the painting and half the height. I've been working on this painting now for just a few days, and it will take several weeks to complete, although I could work on those hillside grasses for months. I think I enjoy doing the grasses more than anything. Moving then down to the bottom left, these are the abandoned houses in that section of the picture, and I've been developing the stonework on the gables of the nearest house. The ones further back are just loosely indicated at this point, and first I drew the stones with a fine brush. I'm paying attention to the perspective line of the horizontals moving up towards the horizon. And here I used the mineral black again, and then I glazed over the stones to unify the surface with a light transparent greenish grey colour, which was a beautiful grey I got in Roussillon called ardoise. Then I highlighted some stones with white. I'm also working, as you can see, on the group of foreground rocks and grasses, and the grass here is already quite a bit more developed than the parts we saw earlier on. In fact, let's have a close-up look at an early stage of building up the textures of the grass, and note here that one of the handy features of egg tempera is that the surface can be scratched into very lightly to indicate very fine lines that are quite difficult to paint with a brush. These then can be glazed over again so they're not too sharp, and that will unify the surface. So let's have a look at another of my paintings that's a section of a large finish painting called Tide Pool, which you can see on my website. And this shows the way scratching and glazing can add detail and subtlety to the finished painting. Still, the technique should be used very sparingly. The light-dark value changes are greatly reduced in the distance, and colour approaches that of the intervening sky. I say the sky is intervening because, as Israel Hirschberg pointed out to me during a painting program in Italy, the sky is not something that goes down behind the mountain. The sky is the atmosphere itself, and it comes down in front of the mountain, and the sky basically begins at our nose, and everything receding into the distance is enveloped in a greater and greater amount of sky, so that things move towards the colour and value range of the sky itself. Here the background headland is receiving a few surface details, but the minimal variation in colour ensures that they retreat into the distance. In fact, this headland will be glazed selectively and worked on until everything is unified and softened and moved back as it is here about 5 kilometers in the distance. You can see too that the sea surface will need to receive a lot more attention before it looks convincing. So I worked on this painting for quite a number of weeks, and here you can see my large egg tempera painting is finally finished. This is the haunting site of the abandoned village on Great Blasket Island. The remaining islanders were evacuated to the mainland in 1953. There were no roads on the island, and electricity never reached the Irish-speaking community in what was Europe's westernmost village. The windows and doors of these crumbling houses seemed to me to look longingly towards the mainland, and vainly so, like an abandoned dog waiting for its owner to return. Many of the Blasket Island descendants live today in Springfield, Massachusetts, and some islanders still live on the Dingle Peninsula in the background, looking across to their childhood island homes. So thank you for joining me on this egg tempera journey from start to finish. Happy painting.